So let's talk about, remember the victims. So we've got the triangle, and then we have our two victims. Let's talk about the digestive system in relation to menopause. So IBS is a really big issue for women. Predominantly women experience IBS, which definitely says, well, then doesn't it make sense that it's to do with hormones, because we have three of them, men have, one of them. And so let's look at it, putting all of this information together. So let's just start with the blood sugar instability. We have blood sugar instabilities. This is like a societal phenomenon for the reasons that I was talking to you about. Food intolerances, too much stress, and a diet that's too high in carbohydrates. So our blood sugars become unstable, which then pushes up our insulin. Now, there's a hormone in the gut called motilin. So do you remember with CCK, there was this connection with motility in the gut? This is the connection. So the motilin actually helps with the gut motility and is connected to this high insulin and imbalance in CCK. And so as soon as I've got a blood sugar instability, my motilin is going to be reduced and I'm not going to have that motility. So then on the back of blood sugar instability, I've got too much adrenaline and cortisol, which leads to a connection. So there's actually a valve in the gut called the ileocecal valve, or ICV. And when we are under stress, the ileocecal valve either gets stuck shut or it gets stuck open. And because of the cortisol is an anti-inflammatory, peristalsis, which is this movement through the bowel, stops happening. If you talk to anyone who's had IBS and it's like griping because I've got no motility, and this cramping because I've got no peristalsis, I've got a load of cortisol going on in my body. So I am, not going to be in rest and digest mode. I am in sympathetic nervous system dominant. So I've reduced my enzyme and my acid production. Now that means I can't digest. And so if I can't digest, all my food's kind of getting really, just like backed up and awful. Because I've got all this cortisol in my body, from what we were just talking about with that pregnenolone steal, I've now got low progesterone. My testosterone can also be imbalanced one way or another. And I've got high estrogen because it's, going dominant if my progesterone's low. Now, when we have, when we actually, so serotonin is a really lovely hormone, but when we have too much of it, we actually end up with elevated pain. So this whole stress situation starts to boost serotonin, and then we end up with this pain. There is a big connection with estrogen and histamine. And so this is why a lot of perimenopausal women end up with more allergies. But even in things like IBS, I can have elevated histamine and inflammation, which will lead to more food intolerances. And then my liver, because of all of these, I get this buildup of estrogen, cortisol, serotonin in the bowel, no motilin, all of this kind of like big storm going on, and the liver doesn't know what it's doing. It just becomes very overwhelmed. This all leads to IBS, or this is IBS. We're literally watching this play out. And of course, I'm lying on the floor in absolute agony. I'm not thinking about eating. So I eat erratically, which leads to more blood sugar instability. And so round and around and around we go with the bowel hormone storm. Now, why is this important when it comes to menopause? Well, what we're now looking at is, because of all of this going on, this inflammation, this imbalance with the hormones, I'm starting to have a knock-on effect with my gut microbiome. So our gut microbiome was only discovered in 2012, so it's relatively new. 40,000 parasites in the gut microbiome, 5 million fungi, 300,000 bacteria in the body. And our gut microbiome is very sensitive to refined carbohydrates, to pesticides, to medication, and food intolerances. So all of those little buglies in our gut start to, get really disrupted in response to the carbs, the pesticides, the medication, the food intolerances, the IBS process. And what happens is the bacteria start to produce endotoxins, and the endotoxins are actually responsible for inflammation. Now, endotoxins are also linked to things like depression and higher levels of anxiety. So endotoxins are not great. And when we've got all of this disruption and the gut microbiome isn't working the way it should, I now can't detox my estrogen properly because part of the microbiome is actually called the estrobolome and absorbs estrogen to metabolize it and get rid of it. So now I can't do that if it's the wrong environment. So you can start to see this picture. So this is one of the reasons why a lot of women really struggle on HRT, because we're putting in estrogen, sometimes too much estrogen, and the estrobolome's not coping, the gut microbiome's just not coping. So this is how. So as I was saying, estrogen is metabolized in the gut. Beta glucuronidase is an enzyme created by gut bacteria. And as I said, it reabsorbs hormones such as estrogen, as well as toxins and drugs, and reabsorbs them into the bloodstream. And if we've got high gut bacteria, it equals high beta glucuronidase levels, which means higher toxin levels and higher estrogen levels. And so you can see I've got this toxic, inflammatory, hormony swamp going on where I should have a nice functioning gut microbiome. And so let's look at this gut endotoxins and the menopause relationship, because it is so common that we get women coming in with hideous gut problems, inflammation, storing sort of weight around the middle. They're trying to take HRT. They feel awful on it. And it's just incredibly common because of what's going on here. So let's actually start at 9 o'clock, this low progesterone, high estrogen part, because that's really, really interesting. So when we have the low progesterone and high estrogen, if you remember, that's just at the start of perimenopause. That can actually lead to constipation. IBS-C is IBS with constipation, and vagus nerve imbalance. Now, what I want to talk about with constipation is diarrhea is actually constipation in disguise. It's the same coin, just a different side of it. So this is all part and parcel. But when I've got this going on, this kind of constipation and that whole soupy stew that I was talking about, it will lead to something called SIBO and SIFO. So SIBO is small intestine bacterial overgrowth, and SIFO is small intestine fungal overgrowth. Now, this is huge because as soon as we have any of these hormone shifts, so they can happen throughout life, as soon as we have hormone shifts, we have more of a tendency to SIBO and SIFO. Now, when we have SIBO or SIFO, it leads to gut dysbiosis and gut permeability. So we heard about the gut dysbiosis on the microbiome page. The gut permeability or intestinal permeability, probably wouldn't fit in the box, is the medical term for it. It's actually when our intestines become too permeable and we actually start absorbing things that we shouldn't be absorbing through our gut wall. So lipopolysaccharide, or the endotoxins that we talked about, come through the gut barrier. Now, this actually is very interesting because it can actually, they go into a variety of places, these endotoxins. They can go to your joints, cause inflammation. They can go to the brainstem, start to cause bother there, and go everywhere. But we also see them traveling to the ovary, which starts to impact the corpus luteum, which lowers the production of progesterone and increases more cortisol. You can see that we are in this constant battle with cortisol, which will then increase our menopause symptoms. So if I've got any level of SIBO, I am not going to be able to absorb any of my estrogen. I'm certainly not absorbing minerals from food. And we just become in this very depleted cortisol gut issue state. It's not fun. I've been there. I know it. It is, as soon as we can start to change this, we do start to feel a lot better.